Hey everybody, what's going on? Hexlex here. I got another Master Duel video for you. So, just a couple of hours ago at the time that I'm recording this, we finally got our announcement confirming that Tearlaments are coming to Master Duel. The time that this video comes out, the deck might honestly already be out. I'm not sure exactly when this is going up yet, but it'll either be the day the deck comes out or the day before. One of the two. So, yeah, let's go ahead and start talking about this deck. This is something that I like to do whenever we have an archetype that's coming into the game that's going to really shake up the meta. And I think more so than even Sword Soul, Branded Despia, Sprite in the past, we're going to see that happen here with Tearlaments. So I think it's more important now than ever before to make sure that we are all caught up, that we know what these cards do and how they function in the deck before we start, playing with or against Tearlaments. And it's definitely going to be one of those decks where it doesn't matter if you plan on playing this deck or not. You're going to run into it. You're going to run into it a lot. So it definitely pays to know how the deck works so that you can effectively counter it as well. So again, as we always do with these meta-breaking archetypes that are coming into the game, this is going to be a primer explaining and exploring the upcoming highly anticipated Tearlaments cards, how they work, and we'll also look at an example build of the deck as well. Of course, one that is geared for specifically Master Duel. I have definitely been spending the past couple of days, even before the announcement, because we kind of knew Tearlaments were coming about this time anyway. I've definitely been spending the last few days doing a whole bunch of research on a bunch of OCG and TCG builds, but honestly, I tend to skew a little bit more towards the OCG, because that tends to slightly more closely reflect what our Master Duel meta is going to look like. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and start talking about these Tearlaments cards. And first, I'm going to talk about the quote-unquote Tearlaments fusers. We're going to talk about all three of these cards at once. Tearlaments Merle, Tearlaments Tearlaments Havness, and then Tearlaments Shiren. See, I want to call it Shiren because she's a siren, but then I say Sheeran and it just makes me think of Ed Sheeran. I don't know. Anyway, so these are all three of the monsters that got pre-hit, or three of the monsters that got pre-hit. These are the three that got semi-limited, and these are what I like to refer to, and further in this video I'll be referring to as the quote-unquote fusers. That's because each of these monsters has the ability to fusion summon when sent to the graveyard via a card effect by using themselves as materials in the graveyard, as well as other monsters from your hand, field, or grave. So this is going to be the main kind of crux of the archetype, right? Getting these cards in the graveyard and fusion summoning. The other cool thing about all these cards is that they can all each mill 3 cards under varying circumstances. Merle mills 3 cards on top of your deck when she's normal or special summoned. Sheeran does it by special summoning her by sending a monster from your hand to the graveyard, which can often be an Ishizu Miller, which can also mill you 5 more cards right there. Notably though, most notably among these is Tearlaments Havness. Tearlaments Havness can actually special herself from the hand when your opponent activates a monster effect and then send the top 3 cards of your deck to the graveyard. So this is what allows the archetype to make quote-unquote turn 0 plays, where you can actually start making your plays during your opponent's first turn, like before you even started your first turn. If you open with Havness and then of course mill the right cards, you can start making plays before, again, you even draw your first card for turn during your opponent's first turn there, which is very powerful, exceptionally so. Getting these cards to the graveyard so you can start fusion summoning, is literally the entire point of the Tearlaments deck. So definitely play all of these cards, as many copies as possible. That is another thing that we're going to be doing. In addition to discussing the cards themselves at the end of each little section, we'll also talk about how many copies, from what I can tell from research as well as my own personal opinion, how many should about be run in the deck there. So, as far as these 3 monsters go, the quote-unquote fusers, literally play as many copies as Konami allows you to. It is absolutely imperative to have a ton of these cards. As many again as we can. It's going to be a total of 6, but that should still be more than enough there. Alright, the next monster we're going to talk about is Tearlaments Reinoheart. This is yet another main deck monster, but unlike the other ones, this is the only Tearlaments main deck monster that does not have a fusing effect. So this is not one of the quote-unquote fusers. However, it does have the ability to send one of the fusers to the graveyard upon being summoned, normal or special summoned. So even though Reinoheart is not a fuser himself, he still allows you to set up those fusion summons very, very easily. The other notable thing about Reinoheart is that it can not only summon itself from the graveyard by sending a Tearlaments card from your hand to the grave, which could also, in turn, then trigger your fusers, but if you use Reinoheart as an Ishizu material, it'll go back to the graveyard rather than being banished, allowing you to bring it back again. There's quite a few rank 4s that this deck likes to use as kind of like a toolbox in its extra deck, and a lot of the time you will be using Reinoheart to make those rank 4s again, so that way you can keep recurring your Reinoheart and keep getting more Tearlaments into the graveyard. So from what I could tell during my research, it seems like builds in the TCG or OCG either kind of ran 2 or 3 of this card. When all the Tearlaments monsters were at 3 when they first came out, it definitely seemed like across the board people were only playing 2 copies. But since the fusers have been pre-hit, it may be worth it to just go ahead and play 3 copies of this card right off the bat. It might turn out that we have enough consistency that we only need 2 Reinoheart, but I think to be safe, I'm going to start with 3 copies in my deck. Alright, so now those are the main deck monsters. Now let's take a look at some of these aforementioned fusion monsters, and I'm going to start with the one that actually got pre-hit limited to 1, and that's going to be this one, Tearlaments Rulkallos. As you can see, it's made by fusing a Tearlaments monster with any Aqua monster, and of course the Tearlaments fusers are all Aqua monsters. That is actually important to note that Reinoheart is a warrior monster, not Aqua, so again, that is actually important to note for fusion materials for stuff like Rulkallos here. Rulkallos, this is arguably the best monster in the deck. I even don't think I need to say arguably. Like, I don't really know anyone who would argue against that. This is pretty much just by and far the most powerful card in the Tearlaments deck. That's because this card, when special summoned, not even just fusion summoned, even if you special summon it later, like by bringing it back from the graveyard or something, it'll trigger then. You can take a Tearlaments card from your deck and either add it to your hand or send it to the graveyard, so that can set up more plays right then and there by itself. You can also send a monster you control to the graveyard to special a Tearlaments monster from your hand or graveyard. And guess what? You can even send Rulkallos itself. And when Rulkallos herself does get sent to the graveyard, even by her own effect, you get to mill the top 5 cards of your deck. So this card is a house. This card is absolutely ridiculous, and like I said, is pretty much as far and away the best Tearlaments monster. Though she is coming to Master Duel at only 1 copy, that's honestly really all you need to make plays. Even then, in the TCG and OCG, Tearlaments continued to see high tournament play even after she was banned in those formats. So that should tell you just how strong not just Tearlaments, but even Rulkallos is, right? Yeah, this card is just absurd. It's frankly ridiculous. I think this card is like, I don't know. You can really say this about the Tearlaments archetype as a whole. I would love to sit down with whoever designed these cards. I was going to say and ask them a lot of questions, but there's really only one you need to ask, which is, this was obviously pushed, right? Like, you intended for this to be the best deck, right? There's, like, no other way it could be. So, it goes without saying, I think, that much like the fusers, you will always play Rulkallos in every Tearlaments deck for as long as she's legal. This honestly may not be too terribly long. One of the interesting things that I noticed here was that it seems like Tearlaments is getting a lot of their support from future sets now. And I think the reason that this is, well, particularly there's been one piece confirmed so far, and that's a fusion that specifically needs Rulkallos as a material. You have to use Rulkallos, or a substitute like King of the Swamp or whatever. But that card is actually releasing now, even though it doesn't come out in a future expansion. That's not something that Konami has done with other archetypes before, and I'm guessing the reason they chose to do it with Tearlaments is because they plan on banning Rulkallos probably before a time when the fusion monster that she is used to summon would come out. So I don't necessarily think this card has a terribly long lifespan. I don't think it'll get hit like right after it comes out. Of course, they want to sell and push the pack, but I wouldn't be surprised if the instant this secret pack, or this selection pack leaves the shop, this card gets banned. I could almost guarantee that's going to happen, because this card is stupid. It's insane. But, yeah. I don't really think there's even any more I need to say. Like, this card is just absolutely ridiculous. And again, even though she's only coming in at 1 copy, that's not really going to change anything at all as far as, like, how powerful of a card she is. So, there's that. Now, we do have a couple more fusion monsters to cover. This one's going to be Tearlaments Kaleido-Heart. This is not the other one that I mentioned. We'll get to that after this one. This one actually takes specifically Reinoheart. That's, again, going to be, where is it? This one here. So it specifically takes that Reinoheart as a material as well as 2 Aqua monsters, not just 1. Which, again, all of the Tearlaments fuses are going to be Aqua monsters. Kaleido-Heart is one of the deck's quote-unquote big boss monsters, having huge stats as well as the ability to remove your opponent's cards via targeted shuffling. So it does get around, putting the cards into the graveyard by just shuffling them back into the deck. In fact, actually, pretty much every Tearlaments form of disruption actually shuffles the card back into the deck rather than sending it to the graveyard. Funny, almost like they planned that there would be a lot of mirror matches and you wouldn't want to send their cards to the graveyard. Anyway. So yeah, it does target, though, so that is worth noting. Targeted protection does not get around this, but it does shuffle the cards back into the deck. One thing that's worth noting is that it's not just when it's special summoned. It's if an Aqua monster is sent to the graveyard by card effect, which, as we've already seen, and also will continue to see as we look at more support, Tearlaments can do this during your opponent's turn extremely easily. So this card can very often be used to disrupt your opponent during their turn by shuffling back their cards, not just when it's summoned. This card can also be very hard to remove, since it can not only revive itself via its own effect, this last effect down here, but when it gets sent to the graveyard by a card effect, it brings itself back, and then it also sends a Tearlament card from your deck to the graveyard, so you can just send a fuser. So that's the other thing that makes this card kind of ridiculous from, the opponent's perspective is, not only do they have to deal with this thing that's going to start shuffling their cards back, but even if they try to send it to the graveyard, by a card effect, which they'll often have to do because it has such a huge body, then it just comes right back, and then it also enables a fuser. So, yeah, that makes this card incredibly difficult to remove. You have to get rid of it pretty much by a card effect that does not send it to the graveyard. So it's a very powerful piece of your end board as Tearlaments. And yeah, often part of your end board, as I said. This is a solid one of for any Tearlaments extra deck. So very, very good card. You will only need a single copy of it, though. Alright, now for their other bigger fusion monster, Rulkallos. This is going to be the one I mentioned earlier that specifically does require Kitkalos as a fusion material. So again, in the actual game, this card came out the set after the rest of the Tearlaments did. But again, I suspect we're getting it early here because they plan on banning Kitkalos sooner rather than later. That could just be me, inhaling my copium, but who knows, we'll see. In any case, Rulkallos, this is another of Tearlaments' big boss monsters. This one has the ability to negate and destroy any card that has special summon, or any card that has an effect to special summon a monster. This card, like Kaleido-Heart, can also bring itself back from the graveyard. It isn't foolish a Tearlaments card when it does, but it does come straight back if it's sent to the graveyard by a card effect, which is nice. You do need to send a Tearlaments card from your hand or field to the graveyard to activate this effect, but honestly, this is not a bad thing at all because this can trigger the fusers if you have a fuser in your hand. And from what I understand just reading the card text, it definitely reads that you can just send Rulkallos herself for her own effect, and then she'll come back because she was sent to the graveyard by a card effect. Note that it doesn't have to be by an opponent's card effect, just by any card effect. So I believe that should also work for her own. So even if you don't have another, like a fuser or another card in general to send as part of the cost, card is still great. Card can still be used to disrupt your opponent, sacking itself and then bringing itself right back. Again, like Kaleido-Heart, this is a great one-of for your extra deck to include on your end board. Yeah, should only really need the one copy of it, I think. Okay, we still have... Those are all the monsters now. Those are all the Tearlaments monsters, but Tearlaments also, of course, like most decks, have spell and trap support as well. So let's go ahead and start exploring that next. I'm going to start with the trap cards, particularly Tearlaments Metanoise. This is one of many trap cards the deck has that allows you to disrupt and also fusion summon during the opponent's turn by, I put B, I meant to say by, sending fuses to the graveyard, as well as getting cards back with the last effect. It's actually going to be a recurring trend with all of these trap cards that the deck has access to. They all have some kind of disruption effect that also requires you to send a monster or a Tearlaments monster from your hand, field, or deck to the graveyard. So the trap cards are pretty great. You know, as I mentioned here, they not only disrupt you in and of themselves, but they then also allow you to fuse during your opponent's turn, which will often be used for further disruption. This card in particular, Metanoise, has the effect to flip an opponent's monster face down. This can potentially disrupt an opponent looking to use that monster as a material for a Synchro, a Seize, Link, Summon, or if they just want to battle with it, or use an effect that requires it to be face up on the field. But one thing that you do need to keep in mind, particularly for this upcoming meta, if you're going to be using Metanoise, is that your opponent is still able to fusion summon using face-down monsters on your side of the field, or on the field in general. Basically, monsters that are flipped face-down can't be used as most materials, but that's not true of fusion summoning. You can fuse face-down monsters on the field, so just keep in mind if you're fighting the Mirror Match or their fusion-based deck, that this card will not actually prevent them from fusion summoning with the monster you flip face-down. As a result of that, I believe this tends to be one of the more optional Tearlaments trap cards. Some builds ran it at 1, and some ran it at 0. It seemed to be kind of 50-50, maybe even more so that builds were not playing this card. Again, I think that might be due to the prevalence of fusion summoning in the format. That might be why Metanoise had fallen off, but yeah, if you want to play it, it's definitely not a bad one of. It's definitely worth noting that this card actually sends a Tearlaments monster directly from the deck to the graveyard, which can potentially be powerful enough to warrant a spot, even if you don't need to turn a monster face down. You do still have to do that in order to activate this card, but even if you don't need that to disrupt, it might still be worth it to just to, again, send a Tearlaments monster directly from your deck to the graveyard during your opponent's turn. Alright, our next trap card is going to be Tearlaments Sulliek. This is another disruption tool in Tearlaments Toolbox. This card allows you to negate the effects of your opponent's monsters, and I horribly misspelled the word being here. Wow, that happens sometimes when I'm in a hurry to type things out, and I was definitely in a hurry to get this all typed up and push this video out here. So, yeah, also being continuous, this card can potentially be used multiple times. So, monster effect negation, pretty rad. It is only negating monster effects your opponent controls, so that a monster doesn't have to be on the field, but that's obviously still a very good effect, especially when you can potentially be using it multiple times. The cool thing about this card is that it's used by sending any monster you control to the graveyard. It doesn't have to even be a Tearlaments monster, but even if you have the big Tearlaments fusion monsters in play, they can revive themselves from the graveyard when sent by this card effect, because the way that this and the other Tearlaments cards are worded, they do the effect, and then also as part of the effect, they send your Tearlaments card to the graveyard. So, ergo, your Tearlaments cards are sent to the graveyard by a card effect. They're not being used as like a cost or anything. And again, all the Tearlaments cards, are just by any card effect. It does not have to be by your opponent's card effect. So, very often you'll be using your own stuff like Sulliek to sack off these monsters. And, we think about Kaleido-Heart, right? Kaleido-Heart can, you can send Kaleido-Heart to the graveyard with Sulliek to negate a monster effect, bring back the Kaleido-Heart, and then use Kaleido-Heart's effect to send a fuser from the deck to the graveyard. So, again, just so much fusion summoning at any point during the duel, even during your opponent's turn, often especially during your opponent's turn. Sulliek is arguably the most powerful of the Tearlaments trap cards, and it seems that the majority of builds play one copy. Alright, the next and final trap card we have for Tearlaments is going to be Tearlaments Cryme. This is yet another bit of disruption. This card has the ability to negate any spell or trap card or monster effect by sending a monster to the graveyard from the hand, as long as you control a Tearlaments monster. Again, if you have a fuser in hand, this is a perfect way to go ahead and pitch that and start fusion summoning during your opponent's turn there. This card is also exceptionally powerful because it's a counter trap, so that means only other counter traps can stop it. And it also shuffles the negated card back rather than sending it to the graveyard. This is actually very relevant for the mirror match, and again, one of many reasons why I, want to ask this designer, like, you knew what you were doing when you pushed this archetype, right? Because, like, this is very relevant in the mirror match, the fact that it shuffles the monster back to the deck and does not put it into the graveyard. So from what I could tell, most builds do seem to play this card as a one-of, though it does seem like you can get away with not playing it if you don't have the room. But I will say that a lot of the builds I looked at did play a copy. I want to say probably about 75% of them. So I'm definitely going to be playing Cryme. It seems like an extremely powerful card, and yeah, just a fantastic disruption tool. So those are the 3 Tearlaments trap cards, but Tearlaments also have 3 spell cards, and I don't think actually any of these spell cards came out until the later set, so it's not 100% confirmed that we're going to get these cards, but given that we did get Rulkallos, it's decently likely we'll be getting these cards in this expansion as well. The first and probably most relevant of these cards... excuse me, sorry about that. Yeah, the most relevant of these cards, and the first we're going to look at, is going to be Tearlaments Scream. Tearlaments Scream, this is a powerful spell card that allows you to get in more mills when you summon a monster, thus further increasing the consistency of your fusion summons. Yeah, literally whenever you normalize special Tearlaments, you get to mill 3 more cards. So, obviously, this deck wants to be milling as much as possible, making Scream a very good addition for the deck. The other thing, too, that's cool about this card is that as a bonus, sending a Scream to the graveyard via card effect allows you to search any one of your Tearlaments trap cards from your deck directly to your hand. So, again, I'm not 100% certain because I haven't actually played with the archetype myself just yet, but I believe this works even if it gets milled, right? Like, it should definitely. So, this isn't even a bad card to mill if that ends up happening. Just lets you get one of your disruption tools if you end up doing so. So, this is a card that seemed to kind of widely vary a bit across the, as far as how many copies you run across the different builds that I looked at. Most builds seem to run this card as a 2-of, from what I could tell, but there are quite a few lists that ran 1 or 3 as well. Given the pre-hits to this deck, I think it's pretty likely you'd want to have at least 2 copies to help boost your consistency. Alright, we have a couple more spells to look at here. The next one here is going to be Tearlaments Grief. So, this spell card allows you to summon out any Tearlaments monster from either your deck or graveyard by sending another monster that you control to the graveyard. Sending another monster to the graveyard is actually the second part of this effect, so you can, I think, if I'm reading this right anyway, I think you can actually summon a Tearlaments monster from your deck and then send that same Tearlaments monster, you know, to the graveyard as well. I think that's how this works, but honestly, here's the thing, right? Even if that is how it works, and this card is essentially more copies of Foolish Burial for your Tearlaments monsters, I think even then, this card ends up being better on paper than it does in practice. This deck actually doesn't need this effect to be consistent. You already have so many ways of getting your Tearlaments monsters from the deck to the graveyard that I don't think this card should be included in most builds. And from what I can tell, looking at, you know, all of these different TCG and OCG builds that had topped various tournaments, none of them were using this card. So that's actually kind of, I feel like Tearlaments Grief, despite being a card that's not good enough to play in this deck, is still a testament to just how good this deck is. I mean, you read this effect, how many decks out there would love to have this spell card and absolutely play it? Quite a few of them, probably. So the fact that Tearlaments can look at this kind of effect and be like, nah, don't need it, that should tell you just how strong this deck is. Very. The answer is very strong. Alright, we have one more spell to look at. That's going to be Tearlaments Heartbeat. So this is a quick play spell card. Is the deck's back row removal. It shuffles back 1 spell or trap card, or 2 if you happen to control a Visas Starfrost. And then you do that by sending a card from your hand to the graveyard. So, funnily enough, this card's actually technically generic, because you don't need to control a Tearlaments monster. You don't even need to control Visas Starfrost. That's just to shuffle back an extra back row card. Despite being listed a lot in the Tearlaments card text, I want to talk about this for a second. The deck doesn't actually need Visas Starfrost. it's generally not worth the minor of benefits for the various card effects. So you might be wondering, like, oh yeah, I see Visa Starfrost mentioned in a lot of these card texts, so how many copies of that do you play? The answer is a big fat 0. You do not play Visa Starfrost in Tearlaments. It's not necessary, and again, you might get some minor, and I have to stress, very minor benefits from playing it, but it's not worth it even in the slightest. Actually, thinking back to all those other cards, there really aren't even benefits to having Visa Starfrost, I think, aside from Heartbeat. So, yeah, I would not really bother playing the card at all in Tearlaments. The same goes for Heartbeat here as well. This card is largely unnecessary unless the meta somehow shifts into an overwhelming number of back row decks. Like, if somehow, despite the fact that Skill Drain, Rivalry, and Gozen all just got limited, if somehow Floodgate back row decks become, like, everywhere, become the next tier 1 threat, then, yeah, I don't see myself playing Heartbeat at all, ever, in Tearlaments here. Alright, so, yeah, I think that's going to go ahead and do it, at least for the cards, but of course, as I mentioned at the top of the video, I did also want to show off an example build for Ishizu Tearlaments 4 Master Duel. So here is that build. This is something that I threw together in Edo Pro, but literally as soon as I saw the Tearlaments were announced, I started putting together this list. I think this is going to probably be very close to, if not just the initial list that I end up trying. For those who are unfamiliar with some of these cards, we've got 3 Diviner of the Herald that is of course used to send either the Ishizu cards or your Elder Entity Natis to the graveyard, just to set up plays there. Our 1 of Herald of Orange Light, we got 3 Maxi, 2 of each of Merly, Havness, and then down here, Shiren, however you say her name. Yeah, so 2 of each of the fusers, because they're all coming in semi-limited. The maximum number of each of the Ishizu cards that are allowed. And we're also playing a couple of Shadal cards. We have Squamata and Beast here in order to make Winda. Oh, and then as I mentioned earlier, we're playing 3 Reinoheart. This build that I initially threw together only has 1 Scream. I could see myself cutting a Metanoise for a second Scream from this initial example build. But yeah, I wanted to start with a build that wasn't too fancy in its text or what it was trying to do. Just a pretty by-the-books Ishizu Tearlaments build for Master Duel. And as I've mentioned before, there are other Tearlaments decks you can play, but pretty much Ishizu Tearlament is just going to be the best one. Like, the TCG and OCG have a lot of data that shows us that. Oh, another thing too, because I've noticed this on Twitter, a lot of people kind of talking about this this morning after these cards got announced. I've seen a lot of people freaking out that, like, whoa, Tearlaments are legal in Master Duel, and they have Chaos Ruler, Grass, and Fairy Tale Snow. Here's the thing, though. The OCG also had all of those cards available to them when Tearlaments came out, and the OCG builds never played any of those cards. There were occasionally a couple of builds that did play Grass, but even then, those builds were not 60-card Grass decks. They were like 50-card Grass decks. Here's the thing about Grass in Tearlaments, and I've talked about this already in my 5 cards to craft for Tearlaments video, but that Grass Look screener actually does not end up being that good for Tearlaments, because you really want to make sure you're milling the fusers with all of your mill effects. And while, of course, you will very likely do that when you mill 20 off of Grass if you're playing a 60-card deck, think about times when you don't have Grass, which is going to be the vast majority of the time, you know? Can you really, in a 60-card deck, if you're milling 3 to 5 cards at a time, expect to hit a Tearlaments fuser and another card to fuse with it? The answer, and I can tell you this from experience playing Adamancipator with very few Excavate targets, is no. You just cannot get away with that. The other thing, too, is that this deck really values that consistency in that regard. So going up to 60 cards, we're just putting in stuff that we don't really want to draw or mill. I don't know about necessarily draw, like, of course, we can play all the tech cards that didn't make the initial 40-card cut, but, you know, we're already, like, fairly limited, and relatively speaking, I guess, in what we want to mill off the top of our deck. And that being, of course, the Fusers and the Ishizu cards, and the Ishizu Millers are really only here to mill the Ishizu Shufflers or more Tearlaments monsters. So in order to be consistent in doing that, I think it is very important to stay relatively close to 40, ideally as close to 40 as possible. Chaos Ruler, the thing about Chaos Ruler is that this deck doesn't really have a convenient way of making it. Being a level 8 Synchro, you would have to use Diviner to send, like, another copy of Diviner and then sync it with a level 4 monster, but that's such an awful use of Diviner when you could be sending an Ishizu Shuffler or the Elder Entity Natis, and it's like, I mean, really, you think about it in that regard right there, it's like, why would I Diviner send another level 2 monster to make a Chaos Ruler to mill my top 5 when I could just normal Diviner, send the Ishizu Miller, and then just, you know, mill your top 5. It's not necessary. The Chaos Ruler is just not necessary. It's not worth it to go out of your way to make it, in my opinion. And then Fairy Tale Snow. Fairy Tale Snow, I will admit, of those 3 cards, is the one that is most likely to see play in Tearlaments. But now here's the problem with Fairy Tale Snow, right? Yes, this deck mills a lot. Of course it mills a lot. But at the same time, what are you actually going to banish with your Fairy Tale Snow? Like, you have to banish 7 cards from your graveyard, and the Fusers shuffle themselves and the other materials, they put them on the bottom of the deck, so those are no longer going to be in your graveyard. So I think you end up with a fairly limited amount of cards you actually want to banish. And, you know, there's also, like, the Shufflers, right? Like your 3 Mudora and 2 Keldor. You don't want to banish those with your Fairy Tale Snow. Yeah, like I said, it just ends up being that you really don't have that many cards that you actually actively want to banish out of your graveyard. So, yeah, as far as that Grasslook Screener, Chaos Ruler, and Fairy Tale Snow, just like we saw in the OCG, really from the time Tearlaments came out until they got hit really hard, pretty much no builds were playing those cards, and I think an optimal Ishizu Tearlament build will not include any of those cards in Master Duel either. I could be wrong. I don't think I'm going to be wrong about Grass or Chaos Ruler at all. I could maybe be wrong about Fairy Tale Snow. And, you know, as with any prediction I make, I'm always open to being wrong. But we have so much data, especially from the OCG on this, that I really don't think there's going to be too much confusion in that regard. I don't think Grass builds are optimal. And I think that data over time in Master Duel will end up proving that as well. Okay, so that's everything I wanted to cover in this video. There is our little primer for Tearlaments that shows off all the cards, how they function, what they do, how many copies you should probably be playing in the deck, and then of course we have our example build here. So, thank you very much for watching. Let's go ahead and move now to our outro. Alright everybody, thank you so much for watching all the way to the very end of the video like this. That means a whole lot to me. Not just personally, but it's also a great way of supporting the channel as well. If you're interested in supporting the channel in other means, you can of course feel free to comment and or subscribe right here on YouTube. I'm always looking to the comments section. You guys leave some pretty awesome feedback as far as like constructive criticism goes when it comes to deck building, gameplay, channel content, all that stuff. So feel free to leave your opinion down there. I will be sure to take a look at that there. And then subscribing is going to be the best way to get notifications of when these videos drop. That does happen every day, by the way, so if you're looking for daily Master Duel content, you've come to the right place. And there are more places where you can get some daily Master Duel content. If you check out the description below, follow the top link over to my Patreon page. There for just $5 a month, which is as much as you pay for a booster pack. You'll find a lot more value than a pack full of filler over there. We've got some previews for content upcoming here on the channel. We've got some exclusive games that are only posted over on Patreon over there. We've got some Q&As, and then you can also have your name featured in this lovely credit sequence where I thank all of the people who are helping contribute over there on Patreon. It's a huge support to the channel, and it really means a lot as well. So thank you everyone who is donating that is featured here on screen. And again, you know, it's not just a pure donation, you do get some more daily Master Duel content over there just for being a part of the Patreon. But I think that's about all the time that I have for today's video. Once again, I just want to thank you so very much for sticking all the way to the end of the video. Again, it just means a lot as I do put a decent amount of work into getting these videos out every single day. But that's about all the time that I've got for now, so without further ado, this is Hexlex, I'm signing out, and I hope you have a fantastic day.